Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week we look at the third of the novellas contained within Nnedi Okorafor's Binti, the Complete Trilogy, entitled The Night Masquerade. This is the longest of the three novellas and functions both as an interesting escalation of Binti's story and, simultaneously, a grounding of the series. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get started. In the first episode in this series, I took some time to discuss Okorafor's approach to science fiction and her definition of African futurism, neither a colonial nor a post-colonial speculation about the history of the continent and its many peoples, but rather a non-colonial perspective that prioritizes the experiences and histories, the cultures and communities, the beliefs and the ideology of native Africans. This is, after all, our first BIPOC Visions of the Future unit, and parenthetically, I found this discussion to be enormously rewarding. This won't be the last time that we study a text like this. But as I say, this is our Visions of the Future unit, and Binti, in addition to being resolutely African futurist, has been an enormously popular science fiction text since the first novella was released in 2015. It has aliens and spaceships and is literally set in the future of our world. If you ask Wikipedia, which you shouldn't, but we are all of us human, then Wikipedia will tell you that Binti's genres are science fiction and horror, which is proof, if proof were needed, that our basic understanding of genre itself is more or less useless. This, I'll warn you in advance, is one of my particular areas of study, and I've said versions of what I'm about to say before, so if you have been listening to my podcasts for a while, some of this may be familiar. I'll try to be quick. I ought to begin, by clarifying this. Nothing that I'm about to say should be interpreted as a praise or a criticism of any particular kind of story, of any kind of narrative form, or any segment of the audience. This is a technical approach to the language that we use to describe and market and sell stories. That is to say, genre. So genre is, at the highest level, a descriptive taxonomy of kinds of stories. Mostly. I mean, even at a superficial level, it kind of falls at the first hurdle because all kinds of things are included in a casual list of genres that aren't really kinds of stories at all. Romance and mystery and fantasy, sure, but poetry? Is that the same kind of thing, the same kind of categorical type? Is literary fiction or comics or YA novels? No, clearly some genre labels aren't about the type of story at all, but rather about the form of the work. We shelve all graphic novels together, regardless of their narrative elements. Maus, Art Spiegelman's harrowing allegory about his father's experiences as a Jew during the Holocaust, sits on the shelf next to a bound volume of Peanut Strips by Charles Schulz, next to Adam Warren's excellent and borderline pornographic satire of mainstream superheroines, Empowered, next to a straight-down-the-line superhero book like our next subject here on Stars and Swords, Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man. These are completely different stories, but here the genre label relates primarily to their form, though certainly there is a discussion to be had about the ways in which superhero comics dominate that entire art form, particularly here in the United States. Alternatively, consider musicals as a genre. Narratively, we are spanning a distance from Fiddler on the Roof to Rocky Horror to Rent to Oklahoma and beyond. This is clearly a distinction of form rather than of story or tone. And I mentioned earlier YA books, which is another kind of lifting work that a genre label can do. Here, it has nothing to do with the story or with the form, but rather with the intended audience. So, The Fault in Our Stars is shelved next to The Hunger Games, which is next to Robin Lefever's Grave Mercy or Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief. Again, YA as a label has nothing to do with the story contained within those novels, just with the demographics of the audience, just like children's fiction or new adult, for example. And okay, you might be thinking at this point, those are all fringe examples. Most genres, if we judge by the little cards on the ends of the shelves that you get at your local Barnes & Noble, or better yet, your local independent bookstore, shout out to the newly opened The Lore and the Green Feather Book Company here in Norman, Oklahoma, most genres work pretty well as descriptions of the kinds of stories you will find inside those books. Well, mostly. But it's inconsistent, and it's often contradictory. Romance as a genre covers everything from 50 Shades of Grey to Pride and Prejudice and back again, so we have a multitude of subgenres, further classifications that refine our understanding. Historical romance, and queer romance, and tragic romance, and cozy romance, and so on, and so on, and so on. What we're striving for here, it seems to me, is a sense of the content, a sense of how this book will make you feel. A specific book on the shelf might be a doors closed MFM why choose enemies to lovers romance with an HEA. That's a happy ever after for those of you who like your romances to end in a good place. We're looking for specificity, and the thing that we want to specify is how the book will make us feel. And this, it seems to me, is both useful because it speaks to the kind of experience that the book will ultimately give us, and it is consistent with the underlying reason that we read fiction, which is a desire that these arcane symbols on the page will somehow transform themselves into actual human feelings within our brains and bodies. And understandably, we want at least some sense of what we're getting ourselves into. So at the highest level, this is the philosophy of descriptivist genre. A story genre ought to tell you broadly what you will feel at the end of the story. Romance stories are all about love and partnership and togetherness. Adventure stories are about danger and risk and victory. Horror stories are about fear, terror, dread. Easy, right? You shelve your favorite smutty, sapphic, gothic romance based on how it makes you feel. Or, and here's a crucial refinement, based on how the author intends to make you feel. You might find 50 Shades of Grey hot and brave and sexy and empowering. That is certainly, I would say, what E.L. James intended. You might, alternatively, find 50 Shades of Grey trite and hollow and clumsy and facile, and a really bad primer on how to safely engage in kinky sex. Come to that. But we as readers are smart, and we are generous, and we respect the opinions of others as well as our own, and we can differentiate between what the author intends and what we ourselves experience. And because genre is only useful as a collective taxonomy, that is to say, it's only useful in the aggregate if we all lean into the same system, we shelve as best we can according to what the story is trying to do. But that takes us to the problem, the challenge of setting. Because in real life, genre is also used as a shorthand to indicate a cloud of conventions, of associations, of expectations, many of which are related to setting. Westerns, for example, are really about freedom and self-determination and justice and social simplicity and opportunity, at least in the American imagination. That's what Westerns mean. That's what you get at the end of the book or at the end of the movie. That's the feeling with which you are left. But they also, of course, mean horses and six-shooters and hats and saloons and ladies in corsets and men who say, ma'am. They also, to the modern mind, mean social inequality and slavery and colonialism and genocide, but the conventions of the genre are so powerful that they are inextricable. You can't tell a Western story without the trappings of a Western story. Interestingly, you also can't use the trappings of a Western story without it kind of turning into a Western story. Consider Joss Whedon's sci-fi series Firefly, which felt like such a fresh and exciting melding of genre conventions back in 2002, but is, from the perspective of 2024, something of a self-righteous valorization of the losing side of the American Civil War. The belief that there's basically nothing wrong with the system in the first place, which is not to say that Whedon is a Confederate apologist exactly, but it is to say that he is frustratingly and demonstrably politically naive and astonishingly comfortable in his privilege, as well as many other much worse things. Did not plan on mentioning Firefly when I sat down to record this episode. Way leads on to way. I did say that this was one of my areas of study, right? Okay, back on task. We can see then that setting is an important aspect of genre, sometimes crowding out the emotional impact of the story and defining a genre space by itself. That is to say, a genre space that is mostly, if not completely, a setting. Westerns, yes, but also Regency England, the forests of the Pacific Northwest, or the rugged coast of Maine, or the deep, brooding heat of the Louisiana Bayou. Could you write a sharp, modern, edgy, feminist, queer rom-com in Louisiana? Absolutely you could. But if the setting is going to be sufficiently present that it carries its weight, it's also going to exert an influence, and you will find yourself slipping toward Tennessee Williams. All of this is to say that genre is an imperfect means of categorizing literature. We need some combination of form, yes, novel, short story, novella, poem, screenplay, graphic novel. We need setting, contemporary, historical, the American Midwest, the mountains of the Urals, the white sand beaches of the Pacific Rim, and we need some sense of our audience, young adult or conservative soccer moms or bi men aged 20 to 40. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, we need the emotional pitch of the book. A happy ever after romance, a taut psychological thriller, a cynical satire on class and wealth. These things, when combined, will get you close as efficiently as possible to a functional, useful description of the book in question. But even then, it's not necessarily easy because centuries of momentum have given us certain ideas of the breaking points and boundary conditions of what genre is, and nowhere is that more clear than in the realm of speculative fiction, but particularly in the borderlands between fantasy and sci-fi. From a traditionalist perspective, of course, this is a piece of cake, because fantasy is dragons and castles and magic, and sci-fi is aliens and spaceships and technology, and the truth is that 9 times out of 10, that is going to get you where you need to go. That is going to be sufficient. But it's not complete, and it's not rigorous, and it's the kind of thing, I think, that limits our real understanding of, and honestly, our respect for, genre fiction. Because Star Trek and Star Wars kind of look the same from a distance, right? Spaceships and aliens and faster-than-light travels, heroes and villains and monsters. But any real analysis of those stories will reveal that they are pretty fundamentally different, even though they look the same. At the other end of the spectrum, consider the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin and Harry Potter. Wizards, spells, friends, dragons, a terrible existential threat, basically the same story, right? And I'll reiterate here, I just named 4 stories, 4 series that I really love. I am not differentiating on the basis of quality. I'm trying to get to something deeper. We need a clarity as to the purpose or the intent of the text. And that thing, to come full circle, is this. What does the author want us to feel? What is the intent of the story? Star Trek wants us to wrestle with moral and ethical problems. It wants us to identify ourselves with the utopian socialist idealism of the Federation, of Starfleet, and rise to the challenge of an imperfect world. It wants us to be our best. Star Wars, though it looks so similar, doesn't care about that. In fact, Star Wars is almost incoherent when it comes to political philosophy, because what Star Wars cares about is cool guys with blasters and good guys with laser swords and bad guys with samurai helmets. Star Wars believes in individual heroism, in great people and individual action shaping the future of the galaxy. Star Trek believes that we are at our best in a community, in a crew, dedicated not to the slavish observance of authority, but rather to our highest-minded principles. They are fundamentally different. And if this analysis anchored in politics doesn't convince you, let's conduct a little thought experiment. Is there ever a time when you're sitting on your couch deciding what you want to watch this evening, when you have that magical combined Paramount and Disney app that we all secretly want in our heart of hearts? Is there ever a time when you are choosing between The Mandalorian and Strange New Worlds, of Andor and Discovery, or Star Trek Nemesis and Star Wars Attack of the Clones, which, believe it or not, came out in the same year and are both the worst examples of their respective universes? That is a thought. That is an assertion that actually requires a little interrogation. I do feel comfortable about Attack of the Clones. Is Nemesis worse than Final Frontier? My gut says yes, but I will need to think about that. Maybe we'll talk Star Trek some fine day in the future. The other candidate would be The Search for Spock, but I've always said that Christopher Lloyd elevates that movie just enough to keep it out of the lowest possible tier. This, though, is the point. After carefully making the case that genre is about what you feel when you finish a book, I'm now going to complicate things and say that sometimes genre isn't about what you feel. Sometimes it's about what you think, because some genres aren't targeted at your heart, but rather at your head. Mystery fiction, for example, often functions as a puzzle, something to be solved, and the rewards that you get are primarily intellectual and only secondarily emotional. That is, you get the thrill of the puzzle as well as the narrative rewards of a sense of justice or catharsis or social stability. I'm going to tangent here too, because God knows what we need right now is another tangent. And note that as well as the heart and the brain, as well as being rewarded emotionally and intellectually, there are also genres which reward us physically, which are anchored in the body. Some kinds of horror make us feel physically afraid. Some kinds of comedy make us physically laugh. Pornography obviously intends to arouse and to titillate. So mind, heart, body, logos, pathos, ethos, these things, they come in threes. And this is the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars. Trek rewards you primarily intellectually, and Star Wars rewards you primarily emotionally. And this is not to say that I haven't shed many a manly tear at episodes of Trek over the years, or that I haven't spent way too much time thinking about the mechanics of the Jedi Order in Star Wars, just that their primary emphases are not the same. You wouldn't go to Star Wars for a stirring speech about the dignity and courage of the human condition, and you wouldn't go to Star Trek for an intense dogfight scene in a sky full of ships and lasers. And here's the further step. Star Trek is therefore science fiction, and Star Wars is therefore fantasy. And this, I really do think makes an intuitive sense. Star Wars is a fairy tale. The story operates on big emotional turning points and clear, direct lines of action. That's why it doesn't get you anywhere to wonder why Luke is so much more emotionally wounded by the death of Obi-Wan Kenobi than Leia is by the destruction of her entire planet, because we're not supposed to be thinking about this rationally or applying a cool utilitarian metric to determine whether the death of an old man balances the sudden and complete destruction of Alderaan. Rather, we're supposed to be present in the emotional immediacy of the story, and I'll argue, we are. I'll argue further that Star Wars is much less effective when it tries to wrestle logically with its own emotional palette, just as Star Trek is less effective when it tries to be more of an action movie or adventure serial, which, sadly, takes us back to Nemesis. Thus, all of speculative fiction, by which we mean stories that don't seek to simply replicate the real world with mimetic devotion to authenticity, but rather speculate about what might be, what could be possible if the world were other than it is, all of speculative fiction breaks down into three kinds of story: science fiction, which rewards us intellectually; fantasy, which rewards us emotionally; and horror, which rewards us physically. Distant planets and alien races, ancient kingdoms and sage prophecies, grim hauntings and cosmic monstrosities, these are the realms of the speculative imaginary, and yes, most stories featuring the high-tech future are going to be science fiction, but not all. Star Wars, in general, is a fantasy story. I would argue that Dune, in general, is a fantasy story. Stephen King's The Stand, James Cameron's Avatar is a fantasy. J.J. Abrams' new Star Trek trilogy is, I would argue, largely fantasy, which is why, though I kind of like those films, I think that they are bad Star Trek. Event Horizon is horror. Alien is horror. And, on the other side, stories in traditional fantasy settings also fall into the same categories. Yes, Dragonlance and The Hobbit and The Wheel of Time and The Name of the Wind are fantasy. But part of the pleasure of The Lord of the Rings is intellectual, for sure. The same is true of Le Guin's Earthsea, of some of Terry Pratchett's brilliant Discworld series, because satire and parody are also, I would argue, primarily intellectual pursuits, because they are dependent on and reward the reader's pre-existing knowledge. Fairy stories often turn fantasy into horror. Think of Pan's Labyrinth, for example, or Robert Burns' immortal poem Tam O'Shanter. The head, the heart, the body. These are three distinct areas of response. So in conclusion, the traditional dividing lines between fantasy and science fiction, or, if we include horror, all speculative fiction, are kind of insufficient for really comparing like with like and understanding what individual stories are trying to do. The head, the heart, the body, in some combination. And all of this is intended to help our consideration of these stories be as complex and as nuanced and, importantly, as generative as possible. Not, I'll say again, because one genre is better than another, but rather because looking at a text in the context of its tradition, in light of what we might judge to be the author function's intent, using all the techniques that we use here on Stars and Swords, these are all ways of getting deeper into a text in order to appreciate it more fully. And I'll confess, it's because deep down I believe that seeking comprehension and understanding is itself a virtue. You can blame Star Trek for that. And this takes us back to Okorafor's celebrated science fiction triptych, the Binti novellas. I mentioned last time that the second novella, Home, takes a swing away from the sci-fi of the first novella and really actively starts folding in aspects of the African fantasy tradition, what Okorafor terms the African jujuist. Juju here is a primarily West African word which incorporates many aspects of supernatural or otherworldly influence, luck and superstitions and spells and enchantments and rituals and so on. I don't know that we in the Anglophonic world have a single word which encompasses the same breadth of phenomena, except, I suppose, fantasy in its most technical and old-fashioned and inclusive sense, but magic, possibly? It's a tough thing to find a real match for in English. And if the second novella, Home, is leaning more toward the magical, the supernatural, the juju, then the Night Masquerade is doing something really interesting in that space, because the combination of the present threat of the Kush, and to an even greater degree, the flashback memories of the arrival of the Zinariah in Asemba, their peaceful pact with the Himba people, and the implicit passing of their technology which allows the Himba to invent astrolabes, which is a really cool detail, by the way, these elements are properly African futurist, but they're framed out by some classic fantasy elements. The Night Masquerade itself, now completely normalized as a supernatural force in the world, at least as far as Binti is concerned, even when the truth is revealed, we're consciously and deliberately leveraging belief and the mythic iconographic power of this symbol. We might also think of Binti's negotiation of her new powers and abilities, even the structure of the plot, the quest back across the desert, the threat of war, the way that enemies and friends are rendered almost archetypal in their moral simplicity so that Binti can try to bring harmony. And then, of course, the end of the novella, which we'll discuss when we get to it. All of these are traditionally fantasy elements. And more interesting still, to me at least, is the way that this novella, more so even than the others in the series, sets pairs of ideas in orbit around one another and keeps them suspended, refusing to collapse or to simplify them. The past and the present, into which we unfold questions of identity as Binti remembers things that didn't happen to her. We oppose the Himba's sacred fire and the Medusa's sacred water. We oppose the inner and the outer. The Himba, we're told repeatedly, turn inward, unlike the aggressively expansionist Kush. Past and present and fire and water and inner and outer and peace and war and dreams and reality and Dele and Mwinyi and tradition and transformation, as embodied by Binti herself, of course, but also beautifully in the evolution of her name, the power of culture for good and for ill, even, ultimately, even life and death. These things are held in suspension so that we can study them and their interactions. And then ultimately, in the novella's most unexpected turn, we have a pivot away from the narrative voice of Binti entirely. We'll get to that. I'm going to note, too, tangentially, that there is, I think, an interesting metatextual quality to this trilogy, but to the Night Masquerade specifically, the African futurist sense that this book is a product of an authentic non-colonial African literary tradition which doesn't really exist, right? Which is itself speculative, but which could someday in the future. The existence of this book itself is African futurist in a way that I find, honestly, a little bit intoxicating. Since we're glossing the story at a pretty high level here, let's take this opportunity to lay out the structure. The first 5 chapters, occupying something like 2/3 of the novella, continue the story of home pretty directly. We're bringing Binti back to Asamba across the desert in the company of Mwinyi of the Nnedi. We find the route ablaze as she feared, as she foresaw. Binti tries to negotiate a peace between the Kush and the Meduse, who, it's revealed, are themselves victims of their hatred and fear. And then at the end of the 5th chapter, Binti herself is killed during the conflict, an incidental casualty, in fact, as the Kush and the Meduse both forget about her. I think that point is extremely important. We will definitely circle back to that shortly. The remaining 9 chapters, each much shorter than those in the first part of the novella, take us first out of Binti's POV and then back in, but we are constantly here building out the world. We're getting glimpses of other perspectives. We're looking at how those dualities that I mentioned earlier are held in harmony and how they threaten to fly apart, as well, of course, as considering Binti's role, elevated in some sense, and then finally brought down to this personal, intimate, comfortable, casual, and most importantly, sustainable role right at the end of the book. Let's get started with The Night Masquerade, then, and we ought, I suppose, to begin with the dedication, partly because it sets a tone for the piece as a whole, and partly because it ties back to our discussion last week about the works of Joseph Campbell. Quote, "Dedicated to those who aren't supposed to see the Night Masquerade, but see it anyway. May you have the courage to answer the call to adventure." End quote. Call to adventure, capital C, capital A. So if you are wondering if Okorafor was deliberately invoking the monomythic work of Campbell in Binti's nested heroes' journeys, the answer seems to be a definitive yes. The other significant aspect of this, and this is also some heady stuff, I'll warn you, is the function of the Night Masquerade in the story, because there's no indication that Binti thinks of the Night Masquerade as a costume or as a natural phenomenon. It is presented consistently as something supernatural. This is some myth-making on the part of Okorafor, and we can easily see a path from the real-world tradition obscured by the elders of Asamba to Binti's genuine belief in the masquerade as an omen. So let's take a look at the appearances of the Night Masquerade in the trilogy as illuminated by Dele after Binti's death. We learn that Chief Kapika was wearing the costume outside Binti's window back in the second novella, and also in the street in broad daylight at the beginning of this novella. Then Dele wears the costume for the third encounter, hoping to inspire Binti through the presence of the Night Masquerade. He believes after the fact that he succeeded, though we know in the moment that Binti sees his dance and knows it's him, though that does not mean that the Night Masquerade is unsuccessful as a mythic inspiration. Because there are layers here that could take us a long time to unpack, because we have to think about what the Night Masquerade is, what it means to Binti, and the nature of the power that it exerts over her. Consider, for example, what Chief Kapika in costume says to Binti. The first time she sees the Night Masquerade, it growls, we'll note the verb there, "Binti, girl, small girl from big space." The second time, it says two things, and says is our verb there. "Death is always news," and, quote, "A bird who has flown off the earth and then returns to land is still on the land. Remove your shoes and listen," end quote. "Death is always news" is a proverb that is attested from all over Africa, the meaning which is often implicitly opposed to other proverbs suggesting that death is inevitable and inescapable, is that death is also always significant, important, consequential. Here, like the implied meaning of small girl from big space, we might infer that Kapika is trying to threaten or at least intimidate Binti, trying to coerce her into obedience. We can see the same thing in the second part of the second quote. "Yes, you might have been in space, but now you are back, and the land is the same. Take off your shoes so you don't leave again, and listen to what the elders are saying. Listen to what your community is telling you." And what's beautiful here is that Binti hears these words, but Kapika's intent is completely subverted by the symbol that he has chosen to deliver that message. In part because he has fundamentally misunderstood who Binti is and where she stands. Instead of a warning about obedience, Binti hears profundity, that she is from space and doesn't completely fit here, so the rules don't constrain her in the way that Kapika intends them to. That she ought to take off her shoes to better hear not the temporal powers of her community, but the land itself, the deeper truth to which Kapika himself is ignorant. This is a uniquely compelling example of the power of story, and you guys know by now how difficult I am to impress with stories about stories, so this one has to be good for me to be moved like this. And there's something deeper here, too, that speaks to Okorafor's intent with these stories, as well as to the power of the Himba culture, which, in a way that I confess isn't completely clear to me, is finally wielded by Binti at the end of the story. The depth of that culture, composed as it is of symbols and stories, of meanings intended and unintended, things which are deliberately placed to have semantic significance and things which accrue a significance through their own repetition and combination. This is why myths matter, why the African futurist and African Jujuist traditions are important. These things can inadvertently reveal the truth. This is literalized in the novella as Binti's body is born on the Night Masquerade costume itself onto New Fish, where she is functionally resurrected. And while the story dwells on Binti's identity as Himba and Nnedi and Meduse and part of New Fish, we're left to consider the role that the Night Masquerade played in her life, literally the thing upon which she is elevated and reborn, partly a symbol of all that culture and tradition, and partly, just as importantly, a symbol of her own rebellion, her ability to reinterpret what was meant to keep her obedient as something which can empower her. Which finally takes us full circle back to Okorafor's dedication. May you have the courage to answer the call to adventure. May you have the power to take the myths that are built to keep you small and use them to fly. Since we're taking this high-level perspective on the novella, let's take a moment to talk about Mwinyi, who, well, this is kind of the opposite of the Night Masquerade, right? Which demands multiple interpretive moves if we're really to understand what is happening, because Mwinyi is great, but his role in the novella, and in Home to a certain extent, is absolutely clear from the moment that he's introduced. So recently, after Binti's combative conversation with Deli in that second novella, quote, "A lean boy about my age and height named Mwinyi was charged with protecting the group. He was the one whom I'd glimpsed standing beside Okwu. Unlike the others, who had dark brown hair like me, Mwinyi had a head of bushy red-brown hair, and I couldn't tell if the color was due to his hair being full of the desert's red dust, or if this was its natural color. And he had a thick, matted braid growing in the middle that was so long it reached his knees. It swung about his back like a snake when he walked. I couldn't understand how this boy was going to protect a group of 19 adults, until I saw what he could do." End quote. Which, I mean, is a great character introduction, but it's also setting some pretty clear expectations. After reading that excerpt from the middle of Home, I feel like you could make a pretty confident prediction about the end of the series as a whole, at least in terms of Binti's romantic situation. He is a good and appropriate romantic match for Binti. He possesses knowledge and has skills that she doesn't have yet, but will pretty much master in due course. He's representative of one part of her identity, and there is tension between him and the representative of the other part of her identity. I mean, he is the Edward to Dele's Jacob in the battle for our Binti Bella. And that typical YA love triangle is part of the novella's deliberate grounding of Binti's experience at the end of this book, where, after all that she's endured, she actually undergoes the return from adventure we've waited so long for. She crosses that return threshold, which we discussed last week. I find the degree to which Binti's experiences are normalized by the return to Umzayuni at the end of this book actually rather funny and enormously charming. Yeah, Binti, you're real special. Welcome back. Everything's fine. You're safe. Go hang out with some other people who've accidentally become part spaceship. It's a classic YA maneuver that asserts a kind of normality. Binti has endured wonderful and terrible things, but they are all within the sphere of a conventional life, at least a conventional life here where you really belong. We're settled immediately back into the structures of the university setting, the friend group, the relationships, Haifa's infatuation with Mwinyi, for example, which is simply acknowledged and then left alone, part of the background noise of teen feelings. There's the developing relationship with New Fish and the bond between ship and girl, which requires some consideration and negotiation so that they can both get what they want, which isn't at all unlike a new romantic relationship at that age, or perhaps more appropriately, a roommate your first semester at college. It's like being an adult, but with the training wheels still attached. And for now, at the end of her adventures, that is exactly what Binti needs. So now that we've spent most of this episode of Stars and Swords taking a high-level view of the plot, let's get closer to the text. The most striking feature of the opening movement of this story, set against the backdrop of Binti's quest across the desert to return to the root, is the immediacy of these wonderful flashbacks into the memories of the Ziranaya, which demonstrate with a compelling clarity how deep in Binti's voice we are during the rest of the story, because these flashbacks feel modern and crisp. They really do feel like a typical contemporary YA kind of voice. And that's a great thing, because particularly in the first memory, in which Kande meets the golden aliens for the first time, that clarity of voice treats the familiar and the unfamiliar just the same. It is still refracted through the prism that is Binti, if only because we've spent so much time with her voice. Cell phones and cigarettes and long-limbed aliens, they all feel strange and familiar at the same time because we're so close to Binti. It's another example to me of just how good Okorafor is at doing something which might seem from a distance to be simple, but which is proven time and time again to be beyond the reach of most authors. And in a broader sense, no, I'm going to resist the urge to generalize out here. I will take the moment to point out the specifics of Kande's community, particularly in the second memory when we switch to the recollection of the man named Take a Good Position, which is itself brilliant. The specifics of this Muslim community of deep tradition and modern technology, this is establishing in history the way in which the Himba people, as all people as we see as we move forward, the way in which the Himba people narrativize their own culture, they defend their own choices, they police their own boundaries. It is no coincidence that we move from the memory of the Zinaraya into Mwinyi's account of meeting the elephants, nested inside of which is this Kush narrative about elephants themselves, which is that they are dangerous and aggressive, which is presumably created as an excuse for hunting them, but has now completely been internalized by Binti. We know, or believe we know, that what Binti understands about elephants is not strictly true. We can see this propagandistic effect on her, and that encourages us to look at all the other ways in which the stories that are told exert influence. And I'm going to pencil in a space in next week's discussion of Sacred Fire to talk a little about the isolationist, inward-inclined nature of the Himba people, because I think it is fascinating and I haven't really figured it out. It is the reason that the friendship with the Zinaraya is possible in the first place. The third memory at the start of chapter 2 makes that clear. Perhaps the Zinaraya could have formed a friendship with other communities, with other cultures across the continent, with the rest of the earth, but the insularism of the Himba keeps them safe up until the moment, which we don't get to see, but about which I'm very curious, up until the moment that the Himba culture reasserts itself as a normalizing force and exiles the Enyi Zinaraya. More on that next week if I can figure it out. We get the excellent detail that astrolabes are unique to the Himba because they are developed from Xenaraya technology, and this happens as Binti feels anguish over the loss of her own astrolabe, her totem of externalized identity, history as personality here, which is an interesting if underexplored perspective, while simultaneously, of course, she's discovering her inherited Xenaraya powers. Binti returns home and we get the harrowing aftermath of destruction, with the roots still burning and the air thick with smoke. She sees the Night Masquerade for the second time, as we discussed. This is when she gets the proverb about death being used and the warning about taking off her shoes. And then she finds Oku and the other Meduse in the lake. The story of the attack on the root and the surrounding houses and the backlash from the Meduse is told quickly, and Binti appeals to Kapika to hold the Okuruo, the gathering of the elders, which summoned the healing power of the Himba people, though what that means exactly is elusive. We're going to see the manifestation, so we're told, of Himba culture, but here it is clear that Binti believes, well, here's what she tells us, in fact, quote, "An Okuruo was only called when the lifeblood of the Himba people was in grave danger. It was only called by elders, because it was to call on the soul of the Himba to heal itself, and that took a power only the old could wield. Usually, the healing power of the Himba is carried within the elders. Even the word Okuruo is usually only spoken by older Himba, thus the word felt hot coming out of my mouth." End quote. So, we have a call upon the soul of the Himba people to heal itself. Binti believes that this gathering, this ritual, this observance will lead to the end of the threat of the Kush-Meduse war, not by magical means, but because she believes that her own reintegration with her people, that is the damage to the Himba soul that we are healing here, will allow the Himba to act as mediators. She is trying to heal this culture, but also to exert a dominant interpretation of what being Himba is. And what's fascinating about the meeting when it happens is just how layered and contradictory those battle lines are. Titi's final frustrated suggestion that the Himba leave their home behind and go out to the pilgrimage grounds until the war is over, carrying with them their valuables, their astrolabe and manufacturing equipment, this is a greater rejection of the ultimate truth of Himba culture than anything Binti has done, because, as we're told over and over, Himba don't run away, they turn inward. Here again, Binti is arguing a more true, more certain form of their shared culture, but that's complicated too, because Binti did leave and isn't truly, simply, solely Himba anymore. And it would have been interesting to see how this process would have worked out without interference, but the Kush return, and Binti chooses to exercise the power of her people in her own name. She compels this meeting between the Kush and the Meduse the following morning, without the explicit healing of the Himba soul that she sought. It's no coincidence that, facing down the leaders of both sides in front of the ruin of the root, it is when Goldie, the king of the Kush, casually says, quote, "I only gave this a chance because of my relationship to the president of Umzayuni, a meeting of men, and instead only this foolish Himba girl is here." End quote. And this affirmation of Binti's identity, a foolish Himba girl, but a Himba girl nonetheless, seems to be a part of what empowers her as she summons the current and addresses both sides. She lays into the king and the chief both, and we get this marvelous moment. Quote, "I incite the deep culture of the Himba. I looked intensely at both King Goldie and the Meduse chief. Neither of you know of it, and that is okay. The Himba council members were to do this, but I think they are afraid. I think they are hiding. I'm not, and I'm a collective within myself, so I can." End quote. And this is heavy, complex stuff, not least of all because it works. Let's look first, though, at this question of identity. Once again, we might interpret the absence of the Himba elders as actually being more representative of Himba culture than Binti's demanding interposition between the two forces. But what's really interesting here is that Binti is perceiving herself as a collective, and in the absence of more specific information, we can only speculate, I think, that she is presenting herself as a collective of things, only one of which is Himba. Himba and Meduse and Nnedi Xenaraya, daughter and scholar and harmonizer. This might suggest, if we're willing to lean in a little bit, that culture is not delimited and exclusive, but that you actually get to be all the many things that you are. I'm particularly reminded here, too, of our brief discussion last week, around the time that Binti was leaving the university, when the aliens observed that human beings are performative, and our speculation there that identity, at least in Binti's world, is an active verb. It is something you do as opposed to something you are. Certainly, this is Binti in the performance of her cultural identity, empowered by all the parts of her that aren't Himba in the claim of the parts of her that are Himba. And there's two, I think, very significant things that we should acknowledge here. The first is that, against all the odds, Binti's plan to incite, which is a great and deliberate word choice, by the way, incite, her plan to incite the Himba spirit actually works. It stills the hearts of the Kush king and the Meduse chief. And we know this in part because one of the very few details that Binti gives us in the closing moments of this chapter is that the king is shocked to see the attack on the Meduse, that he did not want it. The Himba culture, whatever that is, whatever this ritual evocation of her people's nature is, has actually changed the hearts of the leaders of these two forces. The second thing to acknowledge, of course, is that it doesn't completely work. Binti doesn't tell us how or why this détente falls apart. In fact, Binti tells us explicitly that she will never know, but she does tell us that after the first shot, the rest was reaction. It's so disconnected from the evocation of the Himba spirit and the changing of the leaders' minds that Binti herself is explicitly forgotten. She's injured only in the crossfire. It isn't a rejection of the peace process, it's just cause and effect. We see this again with the departure of the combat forces into space above the planet, away from the Himba lands, because they don't care about the Himba lands. It's reaction and reaction and reaction. And what do we call these reactions? To what should we credit the immediate responses which lie beneath conscious thought, that lie beneath rational process? That, friends and neighbors, is ideology. That is culture. And indeed, my sense of the argument that Okorafor is voicing here is that there's a violence done to culture by violence. The Himba soul has been injured by the dispute over Binti's identity and her belonging. And we might readily infer that both Kush and Meduse have been collectively stained, riven by their ongoing war. So the open question, as the novel pivots away in space and in perspective, as Binti dies, is this. Would the inciting of Himba culture have worked more completely if the Ukuruwo had been effective, if the soul of the Himba people had been healed? We just don't know. So this is perhaps the most surprising part of the book, as Binti dies and the perspective of the novel switches out to a somewhat distant, somewhat cool third-person perspective, initially focused on Mwinyi and on a graphic and awful description of Binti's ruined body, leaving there to be no doubt as to her death. This is also the point at which Mwinyi sees the Night Masquerade mourning Binti, which is incredibly mythologically powerful, even as the facade is torn away and we learn that it is in fact Dele wearing the costume. We'll note too the confirmation from Dele that Binti succeeded in her goal. Quote, and Binti had succeeded. He'd seen it even from where he stood on the road. She'd channeled deep culture. He'd felt the power of it shivering through the ground into his feet, halfway up his legs like the electricity, like current. Like almost all the other kids in Asemba, he didn't know how to call up current. He'd only watched Binti do it over the years, glad the practice wasn't his calling. Now he was watching her do what only a handful had ever done in Himba history. She'd used it to convince the leaders of the Kush and the Meduse people to finally stop fighting. She had truly been Asemba's master harmonizer. End quote. So no doubt, given all the authority of this distinct third-person perspective and Dele's position as an elder in training, no doubt that Binti succeeded. I also really want to footnote here the brief passage where we learn that Dele, appalled at the behavior of the other elders, steals the Night Masquerade costume and goes to Binti. Quote, the moment he put it on, he knew what he was going to do, and because when a man wears a spiritual costume he is not himself, Dele found it easy to go to the root, and there he placed himself where she would see him, hoping she would be encouraged. End quote. Identity is a thing you do, not a thing you are. A costume can become a part of that identity if you choose to put it on, if you choose to play the part. You can fake it until you make it. More on that next week. The truth about the root is finally revealed, and in a really heart-touching scene, Binti's family emerge into the aftermath. And it is fair to note, I think, that the rest of the story, this last third, roughly speaking, is all wind down, or actually, it isn't just wind down. It is a deliberate, intrusive, normalizing maneuver in which Binti's experiences are framed as a thing that have happened to her, and the stage is set for her future. It is a breaking point between what has been and what will be. It's a young adult narrative strategy that pays off because it echoes the passage, I think, of adolescence. Binti is changing and changing and changing, and then eventually arrives at a kind of integrated stability, a sustainable identity that can carry her into the future, crucially, which integrates her into her community, her specific community, that is, including Okwo and Haifa and Newfish and the other students and faculty at Umza Uni. Back on Earth, though, Binti is still dead. Mwinyi and Oku get the great scene with Binti's mother, who articulates an intuitive, non-technical perspective on current, which she reframes as life force here, interestingly. And what unites Mwinyi and Binti's mother, to an extent Binti's father, to a lesser extent Dele here, is the African Jujuist building out of the folkloric schema here, the metaphorical infrastructure that supports Okorafor's greater and wider intent, because this isn't just a story about Binti, and it isn't just a story about Umzayuni. This is, I suppose, what I was referring to earlier when I mentioned that this book is kind of metatextually African futurist, right? It comes from a tradition that does not exist, a tradition that is itself speculative, but here we can see it and feel it as part of a broader work. Binti's skill as a harmonizer extends past the point of her death, as Mwinyi and Oku are united in common purpose and take her body to Newfish and into space. We are running a little long here on the podcast, so let's consider this final transformation for Binti, one final addition to her identity and being. And we'll note that Binti's influence here doesn't just unite her friends, but bonds them in community and expands their horizons. It gives them experiences that they did not seek themselves. Thus, in Chapter 9, Binti wakes, a rebirth at the end of the story, which you will note, and had I more time, I would go into more detail about this, but if you're looking for a PhD thesis and you want me to high-five you in person at some point in the future, consider this. Consider how Okorafor completely dodges the inevitable Eurocentric Christian allegory of Binti's death by making it incidental and not in any way an act of salvation or sacrifice or expiation. Binti is not a Christ figure, as she would almost inevitably be if this book were written by someone leveraging a Anglophonic, Eurocentric Christian tradition. Ultimately, then, we integrate Binti back into her society as part of the university, with a romantic connection to Mwinyi, her partnership with Oku, her mutual biological connection with Newfish, and we see here a simultaneous emphasis on change. Binti notes that Asemba will change, that the Himba will change. They might reach a new balance with the Enyi-Ziranaya, and Binti herself has changed a great deal, but we also move toward this new stability, this mature adulthood after the chaos and the transformation of adolescence. And after all of this discussion of culture and identity, we're left with something very simple, but simultaneously, in that Okorafor way, very complex. Your identity is, as we discussed back with Haifa, unassailable. It is complete. It is enough. You are indivisibly, undeniably who you are. And what's more, we don't just synthesize down our constituent parts into a simple, rounded-off identity. We do not collapse all the things that we are into one thing. I think Okorafor is arguing that each fragment of culture and identity within us is itself complete. Look at the emphasis put on the facets of Binti's identity at the end. She is Himba. She is Enyi-Ziranaya. She is Medusa. And to some extent, though this is interestingly de-emphasized at the end of the book, when she reaches the university, she is connected to the living starship. She is not a part of these things, and she is not a fraction of these things. She is simply these things. She's all these things as much as anyone else is. She has a claim to Himba culture because she is a constituent part of that culture, and that can't be denied by anyone. Culture can't be effectively policed by members of that culture. Here we look to the subversion of the Night Masquerade itself, or the unbreakable connection between Binti's father and his mother's people, or Binti's mother and her particular acute form of the current magic. Good culture, Okorafor is telling us, is wide and voracious and wants to include purity and exclusion, though exclusion is possibly the fundamental social mechanism that we see at work in the real world. Exclusion is antithetical to harmony and to happiness. The belief that you are only one thing breaks the connections between you and all the many things that you are. And though we have so much more to discuss, we'll maybe push some of those topics out to next week's episode, our wrap-up on Okorafor's work, with our discussion of Sacred Fire, the short story added to the collected edition, and some general thoughts on Okorafor's work and the world that she has created here. As you can tell from the insistently erratic release schedule here at Stars and Swords, I'm still trying to find a good way of balancing all of this reading and additional reading and deep rumination and actual production in a way that gets these podcasts to you regularly, but also keeps the value as high as possible. I am continuing to work on that and hoping that it does not turn out to be just a perennial problem, just an ongoing, intractable problem. I'm sure I am resourceful. I can find a solution. I am also enormously grateful for your patience. Within the next couple of days, I'm going to release the bonus episode for this unit, a discussion of Neil Blomkamp's South African post-colonial sci-fi nightmare District 9. And then, after we're done with our discussion of Binti, we're going to move on to our very brief metatextual graphic novels unit, in which we're going to discuss cosmological reboots and Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man from the year 2000. That is going to be a short one. It is a very fast read. I sat down just to glance over the first issue, and before I knew it, I had read the entire first volume in about, half an hour. Now, I've read those comics a lot of times, so they are particularly swift for me, but you can definitely pick up the first couple volumes, and you'll get through them in the space of an afternoon. I am absolutely certain. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you so much for your emails. I've had some really interesting correspondence this week about Binti and about some other topics too. We'll have a little wrap-up Q&A as part of next week's show. If you would like to get in touch, starsandswordspod@gmail.com, or visit the handy-dandy contact form over on starsandswords.com. That is going to do it. And normally, I pick an extra little quote here to use at the end, but I am just going back to that dedication, which I think is so powerful and so important. Dedicated to those who aren't supposed to see the Night Masquerade, but see it anyway. May you have the courage to answer the call to adventure. Thanks for listening.